All right, breaking news on the war in Ukraine. President Trump speaking with Russian President Vladimir Putin after the release of American schoolteacher Mark Fogel yesterday. Trump says the two agreed to start negotiating an immediate end to the war. Then shortly after, he spoke with Ukrainian President Zelensky, where he was told they're ready for peace. Now, let me catch you up on how we got here. What is the history of this war? A short cliff notes. Back in 2021, Ukraine said Russia had amassed 100,000 troops along its border. That had then President Biden saying this.
I think what you're going to see is that Russia will be held accountable if it invades. And it depends on what it does. It's one thing if it's a minor incursion and then we end up having a fight about what to do and not do.
Minor incursion seeming to get the green light. Now fast forward to February of 2022. Russian troops invaded its neighboring country, starting what is now a 3-year war. It's been a deadly war. 80,000 Ukrainian troops have been killed, and more than 1 million Russian troops are estimated to have lost their lives. So joining me now is former CIA station chief in Moscow and Fox News contributor Dan Hoffman and the former USS Cole commander Kirk Lippold here with us. Dan, today the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, the part that I left out of that brief history is, from Russia's perspective, there was some fear that Ukraine might join NATO, putting NATO on the Russian doorstep. Today, the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, said that is not in the future for Ukraine. Your thoughts?
Russia's concern about NATO, that's a Kremlin propaganda ploy. Vladimir Putin launched that war to topple the government in Ukraine, because what scares him the most is democracy, freedom, liberty, what's enshrined in our Constitution and Bill of Rights. And what he couldn't have is a neighbor like Ukraine with a sizable Russian-speaking population with close ties to Europe, militarily, commercially, and economically. There's no question that Ukraine is not in a position to join NATO. I think Secretary Hegseth was stating a fact there, and also that Ukraine can't go back to those 2014 borders. I think that's the starting point for negotiations. And I think that on the Russian side, they probably had some back-channel discussion with the Trump administration. I wouldn't be surprised if that happened, where they discussed these precursors to start negotiations in earnest. We've got a channel now established by this exchange where the Trump administration brilliantly secured the release of Mark Fogel. And so it's onward now to negotiations which need to ensure that Ukraine can remain an independent and sovereign country. The last thing we want is for Russia to cast their shadow over Europe, with which we enjoy a $1 trillion trade.
Well, Dan, you and I have had a lot of conversations, and I respect your opinion. I think by suggesting that Russia was concerned about NATO potentially sitting at its doorstep to Ukraine is not me at all accepting or repeating a Russian talking point, a Kremlin talking point. It really doesn't matter if we call it NATO, if we call it, Western economic or military ties. What Russia didn't want was exactly what you just described. It's not something as benign as democracy, but something that represented the West, its influence on their border. That's not a justification. That's attempting to understand what Russia might have been concerned about here at the advent of this war. It doesn't make them right or wrong. It's just attempting to understand their motivation. I agree with you. It's a start of realism to say, okay, what Hegseth said, that's not on the table. I think it's also realism for Hegseth to say the following, which he did, which is there will be no American troops in Ukraine. Let's watch this.
Returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement.
So, Kirk, realism, right? The NATO point, realism. The American troops point, realism. There's not a possibility to return to pre-2014 borders. What do you make of that realism?
Well, I think, Will, the thing you have to worry about is that already the United States has created 2 negotiating points in favor of Russia. They will not be able to join NATO, and they will not go to the pre-2014 borders, because let's not forget, the war didn't start in 2021. The war started in 2014 with the seizure of the Crimea illegally by Russia back then. What has happened since then is they have continued this war with a massive amount of loss and destruction of property, killing of civilians, including women and children throughout Ukraine. And at the end of the day, Dan's absolutely right. Russia initiated this conflict in violation of international law, and there is no justification. The fact that freedom was knocking on Russia's doorstep right there is not grounds for Putin to launch an attack. NATO is not a threat to them. Freedom is, and that's part of Putin's problem, is he's going to have to come to grips with that. But the 2 points that both Secretary Hegseth and perhaps the president gave up is we're already starting negotiations giving Russia terms favorable to them without any discussion of where we're going to go with Ukraine.
I think the problem I'm having with our conversation, and look, a healthy debate is a good thing, is explanation and understanding are not the same thing as justification. And trying to understand your enemy's motivation is not giving a green light to your enemy for whatever action they take. So if Russia is worried about Western incursion under whatever guise on its doorstep, we might have to understand that to arrive at some potential peace. I hear from both of you. Well, I didn't hear this from you, Dan, so I'll put that back to you. Do you agree with Kirk? Oh my gosh, we've started off here by giving Russia two of its big points here. Are you concerned then with what you just heard from Hegseth?
I actually think that was probably the requirement to get the negotiations started. And look, Will, I spent my whole career at CIA trying to see the world through the twisted eyes of our adversaries, starting with the KGB operative in the Kremlin. That's why I learned Russian and served many years there. And you're right, seeing the world through his eyes is important. But look, NATO's a defensive alliance. It's on Russia's doorstep already with the Baltic states and now Finland. It's Russia that's the aggressor, and we need to deter Russia. That's, I think, got to be the goal of whatever settlement is reached in Ukraine, to ensure that maybe there are going to be boots on the ground, European boots on the ground in Ukraine, and a vibrant post-conflict reconstruction plan to ensure that Ukraine is no longer vulnerable to Russian threats. Because as long as Putin is in the Kremlin, they have to be concerned about that.
We have to deter Russia. It seems, though, I'll give final word to you here, Kirk. The goal right now is to start with peace, is to end this war and see how we can then maintain the peace.
Oh, well, I would absolutely agree that you have to get to peace. The issue is going to be, what do we give up to get there? Because part of what you're also doing is, this is not just Russia, Ukraine, and Europe and the United States. Don't think for 1 minute that Iran, who is in pursuit of nuclear weapons, isn't watching what happened to a country that gave them up when Ukraine gave those weapons up in 1994. So there are ripple effects from how this entire conflict is brought to the peace table, what negotiations produce, and what is compromised and given away at the end of the day. Because Dan's absolutely right. Russia's going to have to be deterred in the end.
Okay, I appreciate this conversation, even if we have a little bit of different approach to how that conversation unfolds. As Dan knows, I appreciate the debate, and it's always welcome here on the Will Cain Show. Dan, Kirk, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.